You know, with the massive success of Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow, it was only a matter of time before a couple of sequels would come along to build on top of this blossoming franchise. At the turn of the millennium in 1999, the second generation of Pokemon games, Pokemon Gold and Silver, were released along with the Pokemon Crystal getting a release a year later. Now, while these games weren't the commercial juggernauts of its predecessors, they still sold in droves, along with solidifying the blueprint which laid out the Pokemon Foundation. So, let's take a look back and see how the development of the Johto region and those who inhabit it led to creating one of the most popular franchises in history. Now, in order to really understand what makes these games so special, we should understand why these games were made in the first place. So, let's add some context. Pokemon, the franchise, was already getting pretty comfortable with creating remakes and successive games, specifically with the likes of Pokemon Yellow and Pokemon Blue. You see, Pokemon Yellow wasn't really a true sequel. It was more of a remake of the first generation of mainline Pokemon games, where we follow the path of Ash from the Pokemon anime. In this game, you would miss out on getting your starter and get a Pikachu instead. Then the game would follow the main story beats of Ash from the anime. Now, along with Pokemon Yellow, the franchise already made an actual remake of their first games with the creation of Pokemon Blue, which was more or less an updated and patched version of the original Japanese Pokemon Red and Green versions. Pokemon Blue's base was what Gamefreak used to build the Western versions of both Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. What this franchise really needed was a true sequel, and the new sequel had to be built on top of the solid game mechanics, yet buggy foundation of the original games. These new games would then add a larger region, innovative features, and new Pokemon. In an interview with the president of Creatures Inc., one of the developers behind the mainline Pokemon games, Tsunekazu Ishihara, stated that the ideas for many of the creatures found in these games are formed from their childhood experiences, including from reading manga or scary experiences that they had as kids. Using their past experiences to create new Pokemon was directly linked to how the original creator of the Pokemon games, Satoshi Tajiri, came up with the idea for creating and catching Pokemon. He wanted to make a game about exploring his hometown and catching insects, which soon formulated into the idea of exploring an entire region and catching monsters out in the wild. Now, we gained more information on how these sequels were being developed, with some insight being found in a feature on one of the Iwata Asks interviews. These interviews were being held by the then president Satoru Iwata, who then asked questions to game developers and gave insights on the development of certain Nintendo games that were nearing release. While talking about the remakes of Gold and Silver, Iwata, Ishihara, and Shigeki Morimoto, who was a programmer and a designer on the game, start to unravel many of the difficulties behind the game's tense development. The successes that came with the first games, Pokemon Red and Green, didn't automatically lead to an increase in the amount of developers in its sequel. 4 programmers worked on both Pokemon Gold and Silver. With the scope creep of the games ever increasing, this made the programming of the games even more complicated. The game's development officially started right after the release of both Red and Green. The release date for the games was around the supposed end of the animated Pokemon series in 1998, but 2 other games came into the fold of the Pokemon franchise. The games we talked about before, Pokemon Blue, and then right after, Pokemon Yellow. With Game Freak being stretched even thinner, and the next generation of Pokemon games having the simple, but albeit difficult goal, make the ultimate Pokemon game, many of the developers themselves believed that Pokemon Gold and Silver would be the end of the series, and in the words of Ishihara, it represented the finish line. He didn't intend on making more Pokemon games, so he and many others on the team wanted to put in their all and go out with a bang. But to make the ultimate Pokemon game, they needed to add as much stuff as possible. They needed to pack this game full of content and experiences, new and old, but these high expectations also came at a cost. They began getting sidetracked with other projects and games, like their battle simulation game for the newly released Nintendo 64, Pokemon Stadium, which also started development. Not only did this game push the release of both Gold and Silver even further down the road, but it also came with a huge surge in the popularity of Pokemon worldwide. Now, with the developers' own expectations increasing, along with it reaching the broader public, even more roadblocks start to appear. First, Game Freak began immediately working on localizing the first games. Along with that, Iwata, who at the time was both president of HAL Laboratories, a studio famous for creating the Kirby series, as well as being a board member at Creatures Inc., had the goal of reading through the source code of the first generation generation of Pokemon games, and he would give notes on parts that needed to be localized. He also had to work on Pokemon Stadium, meaning that he had to analyze the original game's battle mechanics and logic, which allowed him to port the entire system in about a week, impressing the original programmer for the battle system, Morimoto himself. But even with these roadblocks, there were still more problems with the programming of these next generation games. Since there were new Pokemon being added to both Gold and Silver, Iwata had to contend with the larger bank of graphics that came with it. Now this is where we get a bit technical, and break down a couple of myths. You see, while Iwata was adept at programming, the ways in which he saved Pokemon Gold and Silver got blown a bit out of proportion. A popular myth with the development of these games was that Iwata built tools that were able to compress much of the code for these games. This meant that a space was going to be taken up, leading to the addition of the Kanto region and the Johto region in the second gen games. This idea started floating around mainly due to a small detail found in the same Iwata Asks interview we talked about previously. As they continued on in their conversation, Iwata started talking briefly about his biggest priorities, how it was not to get in the way of the main staff who were developing the games. So he started to help out in any way he could, leading to Morimoto to state that there were the tools for compressing the Pokemon graphics code. Then Iwata confirms with an offhand remark, stating, "Ah yes, the compression tools." This remark led to years of lore building up about how great Iwata was at programming. And while yes, many of these cases were true, in this specific case, it wasn't the most accurate. It wasn't that he didn't make the compression tools at all, but instead the compression tools weren't for compressing the entirety of the code of the game. There's a great post linked below that goes into more details, but the main points are that sprites in the game, whether it was the first generation of games or the new ones, had to be compressed. In the first generation of games, the developers decided to use a method called run length encoding, or RLE. The second generation used a different method, a variant of the Lunar Compression Format 3, or LZ3. They needed to use these compressing algorithms to save space and reduce the size of the graphics of both the trainer and the Pokemon. Now, usually LZ3 would be used to reduce the size of tiles that would mirror each other, which was a common method of saving space on an already limited amount of storage. But they didn't do that either, as all the storage was still saved onto the memory itself. The idea that was eventually theorized was due to the speed at which you can decompress those sprites. In the Space World demo in 1997, which showcased the demo of Pokemon Silver, it takes twice the amount of time to load in a wild Pokemon compared to the official release. This means that while technically the space wasn't really being saved, the time it takes to load in the Pokemon and trainer assets was reduced. Still impressive, but just a bit different from what we usually hear regarding the story. Now, speaking of the story, let's talk about the much larger story in these two games. Much like many other Pokemon games, we start off by receiving a new starter Pokemon. Our selection of starters is a choice between Chikorita, the grass type, Cyndaquil, the fire type, and Totodile, the water type. These native Johto Pokemon are given to us by Professor Elm. Speaking of Johto, this region, unlike the first generation of Pokemon games, which takes place in Kanto, isn't based on a singular real-life location. Johto is instead based on many designs found in the Kansai and Tokai regions of Japan, with Johto being located west of Kanto. Especially with the architecture and building structures of the temples found in Ekritique City, the influences of these more traditional styles of buildings seeps into the visuals of certain cities. These more unique styles allow for each city to have a sense of self, to a certain extent. The story still remains the same, or at least is very reminiscent of the original games. After getting our starter, we challenge trainers, catch Pokemon to fill out our Pokedex, and finally we take on the 8 gym leaders. Once we receive all the 8 gym badges, we are finally able to challenge the Elite Four, and then the champion. While on our journey to becoming the champion, our main rival is a mysterious person who steals one of the starters from Elm's lab, the one that is super effective against our starter. Along with our rival opposing us, the evil team from the first generation of games is back. Team Rocket, after getting disbanded in the first game by their leader Giovanni after losing to the player in the first game, is trying to find him, but eventually we defeat them and finally end Team Rocket for good. After defeating the Elite Four and ending Team Rocket, the first region, Kanto, gets unlocked in the post-game. There you are able to travel through the first gen region 3 years later and defeat its gyms as well as finally challenging Red atop Mount Silver. With the time skip, parts of Kanto are changed, such as Cinnabar Island being completely destroyed by a volcanic eruption, or some of the gym leaders changing and moving up to become part of the Kanto Elite Four. While many of these changes were pretty neat, for instance the change in time between these games actually affecting the regions in the game, While sure, there's technically a timeline with much of the games happening a couple of years after one another, the regions stay mainly isolated. Connecting both of these regions to each other makes the entire world much more lived in and more cohesive. It felt as though the world of Pokemon was ever expanding, and that there was always something new around the corner. But this can also be a double-edged sword, especially with the likes of a much weaker and less organized Team Rocket. This time, the group felt a bit more like a sad and overused joke. Looking back, the continuation of Team Rocket's story was pretty nice, but they never found Giovanni by the end of it. The players defeat them, and that's pretty much it. We only find out what happens to their leader in an event in the remakes of the games 10 years later in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Not only did Team Rocket not feel as effective of a villain team as the first generation, but the addition of the second region of the game also diluted the entire package. With Kanto being thrown into the mix, much of the levels that felt steady in the previous games, as well as the ones that followed later on, felt out of place. By the end of the Johto portion of the game, your team was around level 40, which feels weirdly cut off. But this was due to the fact that they needed to add in the second region in order to add more to the game. And while I appreciate the effort that was put into adding another region into the game, it felt fairly haphazard. But still, there were new things to look forward to in this game, especially the gameplay. While the main mechanics from the previous game stayed pretty much identical, as it's still a turn-based RPG, you catch and train Pokemon through turn-based combat, fighting trainers and random encounters alike in order to gain strength and skill to fight your opponents and become the very best. It's the new features and mechanics that entice you to play this game. They added time into this game, and no, I don't mean the time you spent playing the game itself. No, with the addition of a clock in this game, it keeps track of whether it's daytime or nighttime and what day of the week it is. This adds a deeper connection to the real world, as some events might need to play out during certain times, or certain Pokemon only being available during either daytime or nighttime or somewhere in between. This feature entices players to explore the world throughout the day, as you never know what might happen during a certain time. They also added much more nuances to the game's battle mechanics through the use of held items. This means that additional effects might occur during a battle, such as when a Pokemon holds a certain item, like a berry, and loses some health. Instead of needing to use a potion, which takes up another turn, the Pokemon will automatically heal itself, with that berry allowing you to still make a move. This new dimension in Pokemon battling added much more complexity to a fairly simple battling system. Not only are there new features to the battling system, but the new Pokemon that inhabit this region also gain some more depth, especially with the addition of two new types, Dark and Steel. This added a bit more balance to the Psychic types, which originally had no weakness, but with Dark types being immune to Psychic attacks, it fixed the broken powers that Psychics had on many of the Pokemon. Many other additions to the game, such as breeding Pokemon to hatch younger versions of it, shiny Pokemon, and splitting the special stat into special attack and special defense, led to more in-depth gameplay. All these fixes stack on top of each other to create a much greater game than its previous version, but still, the game had to weather the storm of the audiences at large. How would old fans enjoy these new changes? Would these new changes add more complexity, thus pushing new fans away from trying this game? Well, with the release of Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Silver, Nintendo anticipated higher than usual sales, especially in Japan. They also decided to release the game in Japan on November 21st, 1999, with North America getting it a year later on October 15th, 2000. And the reception was met with critical acclaim. During this time, many of the critics loved the much larger region and the multiple new features that were added, creating a much fresher experience. The sales of the game also affirmed this idea, as the game sold millions within the first year. Japan alone accounted for close to 6.5 million units being sold during the first 6 months of its release, with Silver being a bit more popular than Gold. In the end, the game sold close to 30 million units, around 10 million units less than its predecessor, but still placed these sequels close to the top of the best-selling Game Boy games. With the games becoming bestsellers, they followed up with a third version called Pokemon Crystal. This enhanced version of the game came with a couple of new additions, including an expanded and different story, as well as making the sprites much more animated when in Pokemon battles. But even with these new additions, the game sold fairly poorly, and that this edition became the lowest selling mainline game in the entire series. This game also signaled the waning popularity of the series during this time, but still, these games and this generation of Pokemon had a lasting legacy. From the larger story, newer Pokemon, and additional features, this generation cemented many many of the game's mechanics and features that are found throughout the entire series. Both Pokemon Gold and Silver were remade on the Nintendo DS, releasing as Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver around 10 years later. These games followed in their previous iterations' footsteps, added some more new features and creature comforts. They also soon became widely known as some of the best Pokemon games to have been released to date. I disagree with this idea, as I think these games, while well made, still had many rough edges that even the remakes didn't sand down. I think that the addition of 2 regions, while a really cool experiment, wasn't well implemented, as it could have been. The additional region led to an uneven leveling curve that made it feel like Johto was half a region. It felt weird, almost as if they weren't even comfortable with the idea of Johto being a standalone region, which seemed to be the opposite of what they wanted to do. If they were able to flush out the region a little bit more and added Kanto as a little treat at the end of the game, instead of being half the game itself, much of my grief with Gold and Silver would have been fixed. But I still can't deny the effect it had on the series as a whole. These games were a development masterpiece. The amount of problems and headaches that arose throughout the entire creation of this game made me respect it even more. In the end, their idea of making the game as the ultimate experience of Pokemon, I think, worked. This ultimate experience eventually turned into the largest media franchise in the world, as well as making my favorite game of all time, Pokemon Emerald. This has been the history of Pokemon Gold and Silver by Gamefreak. I know this video is a bit different from what I usually make, but please let me know what I should cover next. And make sure to subscribe if you enjoy these types of videos, and as always, thanks for watching.